Good evening, everyone. Very happy to be here. My name is Cyril Zammit. I'll be your moderator tonight. I just want to thank you, the organizers of the Biennial, to invite all us here. We have a very interesting topic, so I hope we will be having as well an interaction with you at the end of the first session. So let me go through quickly the names of our guests, but I will ask them to introduce themselves because I think it's the best way. So on my right, immediately here, we have Nawaf and Nassar. Good evening. Do you want to introduce yourself shortly, please?
Hello, everyone. I'm Nawaf and Nassar, interior designer, and I'm working at that field, and I'm happy here to see you all.
Thank you. Next, we have Saamer Yamani, please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Saamer Yamani. I'm a design curator and a creative director, and thank you for coming.
And then we have Aric Chen.
Great. Hi, I'm Aric Chen. I'm the General and Artistic Director for the New Institute, which is the Dutch National Museum of Architecture, Design, and Digital Culture.
And last but not least, Abdelrahman Gazaz, please.
I'm Abdelrahman Gazaz. I'm an architect from Bricklab, based in Jeddah.
Okay, so the introduction is made. You probably won't see what's on the back, but it's probably more towards the audience. The difference between art, design, everyone can discuss that for hours. We can start with this. We have 7 arts, right? Architecture, sculpture, painting, literature, music, performing, and film. Where is design? So that was the first point of question here, not necessarily needing to be replying right now. And then the other aspect is the typical duality we have and the typical fight eventually we have, like art is perceptual, design is rational, designs are created for others, art is created for oneself, art is experience-driven, design is solution-driven, so plenty of all those statements. Let's start with you on the other side of the platform. You are with your brother, the architect who have worked on that specific location here, right? And you were involved in this. You were also involved with some project in Jeddah and elsewhere. How do you link art with design in your daily practice?
I mean, it's interesting with the panel here because I've literally worked with each and every single one of you guys on different things. I've worked with Nawaf as part of the Saudi Art Council on curating an exhibition in the old historic district in Al-Balad. I've worked with Samir on a furniture piece for BD Barcelona. I've worked with Aric to develop an artist cinema kind of cultural piece as part of Mat Lisbon. So for us, I think architecture becomes more malleable the more we learn about the world around us, and how can we shift these scales to really explore different aspects of research. We're a research-based architecture office, but then again, we worked here in the Biennale, and it was another kind of question for us to create a hollow shell for artworks to come into place. So here you see images of the Biennale, and they're kind of gonna go through the whole process. I believe there are some images of the finished product. So it becomes more and more interesting to engage with different creatives like the panel that we're sitting with here. But also on the other side of the spectrum, to be able to participate in art exhibitions. It's always, for us, there's no art versus design. They're all just different scales that are occupied by different scales of our senses. So within an architecture, you occupy the space from a human perspective, but then with an art object, you are very tied to the tactile approach towards touching that object or observing it or doing any of these things.
Anyone wants to add on what was said? Any other additional points? No. Okay. Yeah, please.
As you said at the beginning, Cyril, we could talk about this for hours, and in fact, collectively we have spoken about it for decades.
Yes.
and I think the conversation always sort of leads to the same conclusion, which is that it doesn't really matter, the distinction between art and design. Yeah. We have to remember that these are just words. Now, of course, these words come with different connotations. They have their own histories, but I think if you look at the history of these words, and also in broader global contexts also, you start to see more and more how sort of arbitrary they are. I think we have to remember that this very strict categorization of art and design is a relatively recent invention. I mean, exactly. It essentially, well, I think we could argue that it really is an outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution, right? When you have mass production and then suddenly design becomes something else. A design which used to be a kind of applied art or a different kind of art within a broader constellation of arts, plural, becomes something very separate because of the impact of the machine, and so on and so forth. I think it is a matter also of, and also art, the meanings and definitions of art have changed over time, and it means different things in different cultures.
Exactly. Okay. Nawaf, for you now, when it comes to an interior design project, do you integrate a design piece as a visual artwork first or as a functional object first?
Definitely بالinterior that I have to work with the function and then add the art piece or the design piece by the artist and to have it in the space to give it more strong feel inside the space.
So you work as a balance aspect. So basically you look both if you can link the functionality with the aesthetics.
Definitely, yes, which is very important. Okay. As you said, art doesn't have a frame. Interior, we have a frame. We can't go outside the frame, but in art, blacks is beautiful. We could just forget the frame and do what we want.
Okay, question to Saamer now. You created several design programs, specifically in the region. You have recently created the Nassar collection at Expo, which is an important commitment towards a community over here. Can a designer be called an artist to you? Obviously, it's a bit provocative, clearly. But,
yes. Being a designer, I think we have the right to be called whatever we feel we are doing. And here I would like to use the hat of a curator. So I think the narrative behind the work, I don't know what images here, like this collection, which is Post-Craft, the name of the collection, done by a very interesting and solid and important brand in Spain called BD Barcelona, designed for over like 70 years they've been working. And after doing these kind of projects, they already initiate something called BD Barcelona Art Editions. So the very established design brands start to have art editions in their collections. And I think this is a good answer for the question, where is the boundaries between art and design? It's all about the narrative. If I'm putting the hat of a curator, the story you want to tell, the piece you are presenting. And if I'm putting the hat of a creative director, I think the process of production and the way the material is used as well will add a different layer of lecture, the way you can read the piece and define if it's an art piece and or design piece in case this definition is needed. In my case, I don't really think it's needed anymore. It's like more very flexible borders between both, and as you can see, some of the pieces are purely an art piece, but it has a function. So I think the ambiguity now become really a comfortable place for curators who would like to be provocative, like in my case.
And we were talking about 10 years ago with Aric a few minutes ago. 10 years ago, you would say, more or less, a design piece is something you use. An art piece is, let's say you take a chair, you use it, it's a design piece. You take the chair, you put it on a pedestal, it becomes an art piece, right?
Totally.
Not anymore, right?
No.
We all agree that everything is blurry and we happily cross the borders at any moment, any time, right? Yeah. Aric, we stay with you in the museum world that you're now familiar with. We consider that the design styles of movement, like for example, the modernist, the Stil, the Scandinavian, is a purely functional trend of making furniture, or is that a true artistic expression?
Well, that's interesting, yeah, because if you actually look back at a lot of these sort of 20th century movements, you know, that a lot of it was actually explicitly aiming to dissolve the boundaries between art, design, and craft, and life in society. Really, I mean, these sort of early modern, early 20th century modern movements were very much socially driven and also derived from the influence still of this notion of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the sort of Wagnerian idea that life is a total work of art, right? You're sort of performing within a space, and it's all art, and it should all come together. So in that sense, you know, I think you can make a strong argument that, you know, the intention with these movements that you refer to was to not have the to not draw these distinctions between the discipline, where I think we could probably identify a lot of, you know, moments when this changed. I think one of the moments would be the Bauhaus, you know, in 1921, when it moved from Weimar to Dessau. It was under a lot of, I mean, the Bauhaus, we all think of it as being sort of, you know, form and function and industrial design and so on and so forth, and that's what it became. But it started out as a very sort of experimental, almost kind of new agey, hippie, you know, mystical kind of assemblage of quacks, you know, who were, and it became more commercially oriented when they were kicked out of Weimar by the government at that time, and went to Dessau and were under pressure to make money, and so that's when you start getting the Bauhaus wallpapers and so on and so forth. That's where the kind of ideology starts to turn into kind of product. But I mean, if we're talking about being provocative, you know, sometimes when I'm feeling very naughty and this topic comes up, I sort of, you know, like to say that to oversimplify, and this is very, very, very reductive, you know, if we could once say that art was, that design was about products and commodities, like making things to sell, you know, these kinds of things, whereas art was about ideas. We could say perhaps now that it's reversed. In some ways, art is what's become about commodity. When you look at the growing influence of the art market and the art fairs, how people sort of, you know, pick and choose their Damien Hirst and Oliver Eliasons almost from a catalog and from PDFs, and they a lot of collectors are buying on speculation for financially for investment purposes. In some ways, it's art now that's become the commodity. Whereas if you look at current design practices, which are much less object-based than they used to be. If you go to design biennials, you'll see a much greater focus on research and kind of addressing current social and ecological issues and so on and so forth. And in some sense, it's design now that's more about ideas and less about product.
If you allow me to add something on this, please. I think we are in a very interesting era where the figure of a designer maker is becoming more dominant. And that actually is the designer maker is actually questioning so many questions about the production processes. I think the pandemic also put a lot of questions on the table. No, the process of production, the supplier chain of materials, the local resources, and these questions become like very crucial when it comes to let's put definition of the work of the designer and the maker. Here come also you can see the integration of crafts in a different way, because the craftsman become more designer or designer become more handy. The artists always say, we produce our work. Now the designer is saying, I do produce my work as well. So it's an interesting era to make definitions. I think if definitions are needed, I'm always putting a big if here. And I think what is also very important here, that it was demonstrated by scientific that working by hand and doing things by hand has this relaxing effect, and it's a kind of therapy. So a lot of designers were very stressed of the production processes, actually are now leaning on these abilities, leaning on these new ways of production. So it's an interesting, from my point of view, interesting time to see. And we have here Gazaz Brothers, as I brand you before, which is Bricklab. They are designer maker, architect maker, something that it's not very familiar in our region. We are very much white gloves architects and designers, but when it comes to Bricklab, they are hands-on all the time. So there's an important change in paradigm of production, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, and I totally agree with you that we need to define between designer, makers, because we don't have it yet, Abdurrahman, here in Saudi. It's mixed between contractor and designer.
It is definitely mixed, and I think this is something we always face in our practice. People come up to me and ask me, are you an artist or a designer? And I'm like, I research, and whatever byproduct of this research is, it is what it is, you know, regardless of its scale. So again, kind of referring back to working on the Biennale, I think it was a point of research for us to start understanding the natural setting of the Wadi itself, but also, let's say, the man-made infrastructure of the site. And to kind of, the challenges that we had on site actually made us find better design solutions, but also generated the discussion with the scenographers, with the curators. So it became kind of the whole team, including the Biennale team, we all became integrated. And that's when it disseminates what our role is. We all kind of become one team that's looking over all of this, but in that sense of research, it almost becomes this feedback on understanding the natural setting, but also the built environment around us. And I think that also kind of transcends this conversation. I mean, I worked with Athar Gallery before, where we created these objects, over 1,000 objects, and placed them on 2 different plinths. And we questioned what is an art object and what's a design object. And we interchanged some of the items, being more expensive on the art side and being cheaper on the product side. Nothing got sold. So the experiment completely failed. But it was really interesting to really start investigating this notion of where, I think, do we as professionals fit into a certain category, or is this kind of categorization diminishing over time?
Can I ask a question? So, like, you know, of course, it's totally reasonable to say, you know, there's no distinction between artist, designer, craftsman, maker, contractor, and that's a problem. But I'm wondering if you guys could explain a little bit more why do you think that's a problem here. Now, I mean, not just from a practical sense, or maybe from a practical sense. I mean, because when you talk about your exhibition, where nothing's sold, right? You know, conceptually, that's not a problem, but of course, practically, it is. And when we talk about whether someone should be called a designer or artist, we briefly spoke about this earlier, Cyril. I mean, there's one well-known design duo who, a few years ago, began insisting on calling themselves artists. And yeah, okay. So if you don't mind, maybe I'll. And so, you know, and I asked them why, and they're very, very honest and transparent. They said, if we call ourselves artists, we can charge more money for our work, right? So, I mean, like, how do you find this dynamic working within the Saudi context? I mean, is it why is it important to have these firm categories and roles of artist, designer, craftsman, contractor, etc.?
It's interesting for me because on one end of the spectrum, I don't like to fit into one category. But I think on the other side, kind of compartmentalizing these titles, let's call them, is you'd find certain artists within the context of Saudi that are very passionate about art making, but their passion would really lean towards the production of the artwork, but there's no market for that here, or there's no infrastructure for producing artworks. So you actually have to push yourself to be on one end and fully produce something while your interest really lies in the mechanics of it. And I think that becomes, I don't think it's problematic to fit into a category or to kind of disintegrate these roles. But I think it's interesting to gauge where you stand in all of this. I mean, you guys said that I'm a maker. I just make concrete and I pour things into molds, so I'm not really that great in making things. But it becomes even more interesting to generate that dialogue in a almost like a national context that fits into a wider global context of what are the professions that stem from the realm of art and design, and how can we harness these skills, whether be it through craft, digital design, any of these things. I think becomes just almost something that's very fascinating to me, at least.
And do you think as well that we need the right platform to show the design pieces and to define what is the design pieces is? Are we missing this, do you think?
I mean, we now have the Biennale, and we also have Saudi Design Festival just around the corner. So things are starting to emerge. But I think, again, that could be problematic because it's like, okay, do I show here or do I show here?
It's new for us.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very new.
Yeah.
Yani this, it might be important to be starting with the educational, with the schools,
Definitely.
for the upcoming generation to understand what is design and what is art. لأنه still it's not clear for us here in Saudi. Yani, from my little experience 10 years back when we started with the 2139, we receive the student to the exhibition, the questions they ask, it's nice, I'm happy to hear it, but the message is they are missing big information about art from school. So now back to your things, and which is good, we have the Biennale, it's good, we have the Saudi Design Week and the 21 and all the another initiative, but I think we need to be more strong with the schools to...
Definitely.
Sorry, but I think that's the question, right? Because this as we were saying earlier, this kind of constructed distinction between art and design is very much a result of certain like the institutionalization and professionalization of design, you know, partly through the way schools and various curricula have been structured. But now schools are many schools are trying to kind of go away from that. So the question is, you know, should the professions continue to try to sort of encourage the schools to reflect how the professions work, or should maybe the professions sort of begin to open up in an interdisciplinary way that the schools are? And this also goes back to kind of cultural questions also. So I mean, I think maybe one of the reasons I was invited on this art versus design panel was because until recently I was curatorial director for Design Miami, which is, you know, a collectible design, or used to be called design art. Fair.
You're basically jumping on all my questions.
Oh,
but I'm good. No, it's good. It's good. So I don't have to ask them. So please go with the flow. Please go ahead. Go ahead.
And so, long story short, we just launched a sort of mini version of the fair in Shanghai, in China. And of course, there a lot of people were like, you know, so is this art or is this, you know, looking at all this weird furniture, right? That's clearly not designed with function per se, or ergonomic function per se in mind. And you know. And really pushing this question of what, is this design? It's not design, and so on and so forth. And I would sort of talk about how you know, these lines are blurring and so on and so forth. And they'd be like, well, you know, that's a very Western idea. And I'm like, actually, it's not. It's actually the other way around. You know, in fact, this art design distinction that you're so concerned about is really what the Western invention is really the Western invention. If you look at the history of China, there was no distinction drawn for thousands of years between, you know, the so-called fine and decorative arts, to say nothing of what you might call art and design. So I think it's worth sort of really just stepping back even more and really questioning all of our assumptions about why things are the way they are, and if in fact the status quo is the way to go. Yeah.
So in that aspect, if we talk about art design and all those new terminology, should we avoid to call an object and becomes just a creation and an art piece? Obviously, we try now to break the burden between art versus design. So what is the new semantic we need to use when it comes to a designer who no longer wants to be called a designer but being called an artist. So what he or she is producing, is that an art piece? Is that an object? Is it a furniture piece? Where do we play with those words here? So Samir, I see you.
If you allow me, I would like to engage the audience with this, and I would like to vote. Yeah, please. Let's vote on a work and decide if it's an art piece or a design piece. This is a rug, actually, that was produced based on digital process of mimicking the hands movement by robots, mimicking the hands movement on a lady doing sedu in Abu Dhabi and a man doing a fishnet in Abu Dhabi as well. The result of the robot processes of mimicking the hands movement were data that was visualized by software and a data visualization artist who produced these patterns that later on were sent to craftsmen in Nepal, where they had to weave these designs on a rug using a very new high-tech material, I would call it, which is sustainable material called econyl, which is a recycled old fishnet from the ocean. Once the piece was done in a very traditional way by Iwan Maktabi Lab, by the way, he's attending the talk as well. This piece was sent to Barcelona to the Advanced Architecture Institute, where they have a huge robot, where that robot drew the other pattern of the man hands movement over it, injecting ink. So for you guys, I would like really to take it become a piece, that it's collectible piece, like we think we have like 5 countries involved in producing that piece. Is it art? Is it design? Is it a unique piece? Is it a research? Should we vote? Should we see who see it as an art piece and who see it as a design piece? So let's count. Wait, art piece?
Well, a large majority.
Oh.
I mean, the audience who are following us on
And
social
design
media, they
piece.
probably don't see, but there's a large majority.
And a design piece, guys?
2, 3.
Even the
you can double the
producer
price
consider
now,
it as
Summer.
an art piece.
There you
So
go.
as you can see,
That's perfect. That's exactly
I
the
think
point.
this is the good experiment to
So
explain the question.
extending this, the way that, as Aric was saying, that some of the designers absolutely now insist of being called artists, and there's no shame on that these days, but a few years ago it was eventually a question. Is it because they are ashamed of being called just purely a designer? Is it too restrictive, and because artists give you a freedom of movement so you can play around that? Do you think so?
I think designer as a figure, as I told you before, it was like a very in office and software and stuff, so it wasn't that cool, wasn't that free. But now a designer going on a bicycle in Barcelona to his studio to work by hand, I think is really cool. So there's no need anymore to put that, I'm a designer, I'm an artist. And again, all the production processes is changing and the perception is changing. The producer of the piece considered as an art piece.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine how things are changing. I don't think, I practically when I work, I don't think if the data visualization artist that Edward Kabay work with us will consider this a design piece, so he's not get involved. He immediately get involved as a designer. At the same time, a design brand get involved as an art producer.
Yeah.
So I don't have these definitions practically, and I don't think we should have it in any way. But back to your conversation, having here the Biennale and the design festival there, I think the way you are doing Saudi style things, I think very soon we will have a space between the two events happening where part of the people here would like to be and part for people there.
sure.
And by few years, I think that will become a very creative space for all the people who would like to create things.
Yeah, and at the end of your chain of thoughts, and then going to Abdelrahman on this, I mean, over 100 years ago, there were architects, right? And the architects were doing the house, the furniture, they're doing everything as a full concept. You said it earlier on as well, that you basically now have a different completely, let's say, mission or task or list or duties whenever you do something, because you integrate a lot of things as well. For a few decades, we had designers only doing product because they wanted to detach themselves from the architectural aspect. So for you, is that the future trend is that blurry, and blurry will stay because these days in this global village we live in, there's no black line that basically block one section to another? What's your thought on that?
mean, I wish I could ground myself into doing smaller things. But yeah, I think that's the way that it's moving so far. Yeah. I mean, for us, it's always a matter of collaboration. Yeah. I mean, not to dwell on the projects that we do, but when we just curated a show that involved restoring a house in Jeddah called Saudi Modern. But do we call ourselves curators? It stems from an architectural research between the 30s and the 60s in Jeddah, and it's a purely architectural exhibition. We had to produce maquettes. We had to do the research, do the writing, all of these things. So I don't think for each his own, but where we fit in, I think it's this kind of multitude of research approaches that come out in a different sort of material, whether be it a tactile material or something that's purely theoretical. Yeah.
Is it the beautiful exhibition that you did, Saudi design? I do recommend if anyone didn't visit, it's a must to be visit. That is the trend now in Saudi for this couple of years coming and the 10 years past. Is it the trend to go to an exhibition, art initiative? We don't have the architectural, which is the... I
mean, that becomes interesting because the exhibition was supposed to be a book. So to reach a wider audience, because for us, it kind of goes back to this educational component of everything. How do we engage with families and children alike, artists, and people who basically visit 2139, and therefore we extended our exhibition to the 31st of March, which was asked of us from 2139. Yeah, thank you for that. So I think we started engaging with 8 different artists to look at architecture. So for us, it's always kind of, although we push ourselves beyond our own limits and boundaries and are always overwhelmed, we also tried to push the artists to explore the very urban fabric of Jeddah, whether be it some artists were from Palestine, some of them were from Khobar, some of them were from Riyadh. So it enriched the exhibition, although our goal was just to reach a wider audience. But I think with that comes also the responsibility of generating a public program, which again, in March, we're going to be doing something. And I think it's always kind of this back and forth conversation. I mean, the exhibition itself, we went into the house, we revived the house, we worked with the family that provided us the house, who are now thinking of reusing it. So there's so many layers of how you can function as an individual. And I think ultimately we purely see ourselves as individuals trying to influence other people to do very much the same. So if I see things that are popping up in a similar fashion, that's great. That for me, the search for originality is over. And it's all about us this collective energy of working together to tackle different points of research.
I would like to add something about audience engagement that is really interesting here. As you mentioned, I've been working for Expo as the director of design program, and it's a mega event. It's not an art museum. It's not a design museum.
11 million so far, right? Visitors.
Yes, and before the pandemic, it was supposed to be more. So imagine how institutions also are actually giving us this challenge, because when I get approached by Expo, we would like to have a content about design that is addressed for millions of people. Do you imagine my face when I hear that brief? And I should say that I do respect when institutions, such huge institutions in the region we are very lucky that they give us as curators that freedom. This piece, for example, was produced exclusively for Nassar, the Emirati design platform at Expo 2020 Dubai. And they were so keen in opening debates and making questions, which is a very artistic approach. Yet they are very keen to bring audience, and to have functionality, which is a very design approach. So I think it's in all levels, from the producer to the designer to the artist to the institution, and by default will be by the audience also as well.
3 more questions, because then we need to open the conversation to our audience. Nawaf, you mentioned a word very specific earlier on. You say brief, right? When you get a brief from a client or whoever wants to use your skills and your expertise. What's your liberty in your brief? Because, you know, we were saying at the beginning, oh, the artists have a full liberty to express themselves the way they want to. Don't you have that liberty when you work with a client in an interior aspect, for example?
Okay.
Can you support, guide your client in a certain direction that you want to?
Yeah, definitely. يعني from my little experience, 30 years بالinterior design field in Saudi. I did project in Saudi. I did project in Cairo, Lebanon, Paris, New York, London, south of France. Now, the language with my client when we start to design any space, it's completely different when I'm in Saudi because of the lifestyle. So I have to talk the same language and I have to start to fix this lifestyle that they need to have. And definitely it's a big challenging to do that. But في طبعا still which is not, I'm not saying it's bad, but I'm saying there is a big lack of information in our society, what is interior design and what is art. What we have here in Saudi, which is I'm very proud of, it's a beautiful international art exhibition and beautiful Saudi Design Week, but I'm talking about the majority. So as a designer, sometimes I'm wearing the hat of a teacher, which is very hard to do it, but it's a challenging for me. That's why beside my job, I teach at the university. I find it is much nicer, so it will be great. So the new generation, they won't give a hard time to any designer. But it is, I do give a brief, and it's a completely different. Yani we still, as a designer, we don't have the platform.
Yeah. Let's move on to the million-dollar question before we open the floor to the questions. And obviously, the million-dollar question is the NFT, right? So is it the ultimate opportunity for designers to reach the artistic level? Because obviously, we reach into a situation like we can see here, the Andres Reisinger piece. Is it definitely something which is, if we want to be pessimistic, but obviously the entire conversation shows we don't need to be the last chance of designers to become artistic, but obviously we clearly position ourselves that there's no reason to be pessimistic because designers are artistic. So Aric, because you're the leading head for that Museum for Architecture, Design and Digital Culture, obviously it goes to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess to draw a distinction between design in whatever the metaverse or metaverses will be versus NFTs. I mean, I think this is a good example. I mean, I think he is a trained designer, but this is a good example.
And that was a physical piece first,
yes,
specifically this one.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think the necessity of that physical piece, and more importantly, the skills and access required to make that physical piece will clearly become less and less important. I mean, when you hear about all the trading of virtual objects now in Fortnite and whatnot, clearly you are seeing whether it's a democratization of the designer of design or a dissolution, meaning dissolving of the role of the designer. Something is definitely shifting, and in fact. It's this that may sort of increasingly push us over the edge and finally, for better or worse, ending this art versus design debate, because it's all going to be just a series of sort of images that anyone with a screen and some basic programming skills can do, and then value then becomes defined by that metaversal market. How much is someone willing to pay for it, and that does then put people in the ranks of Picasso and so on and so forth in terms of market value. So, how we feel about that is a whole other discussion. But when it comes to NFTs, I actually had a big argument with a friend about this recently, because a friend who is very both financially and emotionally invested in NFTs. I want to start by saying that I think NFTs offer incredibly fascinating opportunities for really interesting things to happen. I do not dispute that, but as far as I can tell at the moment, most of it is basically just a very energy-intensive way of verifying contracts and creating artificial scarcity to make PDFs very, very expensive. Now, that's not to say that that's where it's going to stop. I'm sure there are many, many smart people out there who are going to come up with lots of brilliant new ways within the cultural realm. I mean, NFTs are not just in the art field, of course. The applications expand. I mean,
that could be the watch industry, it could be anything.
Supply
right?
chains
exactly,
and you know, all that stuff. But I think this then just sort of reinforces the role of the market in defining and reinforcing these sorts of categories of art and design. In some ways, it's the NFT, like so many other things in the digital sphere, is kind of has the potential just to sort of accelerate and exaggerate and hyperbolize the mechanisms that are already at work. You know, in the sense that, like, you know, so much with the digital world has become the opposite of the utopian idealism that it started with. Right? I mean, the metaverse being a good example, or how things become the opposite of the original intention. We have to remember that the metaverse was coined by Neil Stephenson in Snow Crash, his 1990-something book, and it was meant as a dystopian warning to us. And now, you know, 30 years later, it's being celebrated as the future by Mark Zuckerberg. So to go from that to now, I think is very instructive about the sometimes unintended consequences and the unknowns that come with these things. So the same thing goes with NFTs, obviously.
Can I add something? Andres is Barcelona-based, I think, ambiance designer, because I don't think the piece was done physically first. It was an image. Then he decided to do it. I can't remember the details, but let's add a question for this. I heard that he get paid that money in crypto money. So I would like to ask him now, when the value of this money is lost, what actually is the value of what's happening? So please add to that question, is the NFT and the way it will be paid.
And the retribution.
Exactly, it's become like more boundaries to understand, to explore. I just want to add this because, they were very happy to get paid last year, but I would like to see now how they're feeling with that. It's a question to be also discussed.
That's very good. We have very few minutes left because there's some other talks after us. So please, if you have questions in the audience, feel free to ask. Technically, we have 6 minutes left, so let's have quick answers from the panel and the panelists. So if anyone has a question, over there.
Maybe we can hear you, Ammar.
The question actually is for you, Mr. Sami. You mentioned it's a blurred boundary now for designers and artists to create an object that is usable and usable at the same. And you mentioned about the collaboration or the coexistence between the Biennale and the Saudi Design Festival. Would you encourage that more? Would you encourage designers to create more art and the art to collaborate with designers?
Yes, to be sure, because Cyril is looking. Yes, and I do that through my work. And yes, it's a must. And I think when we are producing as designers or creators, whatever, this content, the organization behind the Biennales and the design fair will find a space for you guys to put this, let's call it ambiguous work, which is, I think, with time will be more diluted, all these boundaries. Thank you, Ammar.
Other question? Yes?
I'm just wondering why the question in the pattern is the interchangeability between art and design. I'm just wondering, why are you asking this question?
I think it's just because it's important in these days, in this part of the world we're living, is that we need to, what expression that everybody is using, it's overrated, is thinking out of the box. I think it's important that so many times we have been putting labels on people, and so many times we have been in situation. I ran a design fair for a long time. And when I introduced craft the second year, I had some very important Western galleries running over me, being absolutely furious, saying, how dare you bringing craft in limited edition, you know, you're basically bringing us down, or the value, whatever. And I kind of ignored it, because I think it's important that whenever there's an artistic expression, and we go back to the word art here, then it's fine if it's through your hands because you're creating something for a painting, or through your hands because you're creating something as an object. You have this process of thoughts, and it's important to not look down on one discipline and put up another discipline, because there's no reason to, right? I mean, it's you know, we talking about the NFT and the crazy prices, but remember 2 years ago in Miami Beach, that banana on the wall was sold for like nearly $300,000, and the guy who bought that ate it 2 days after, right? So that art piece doesn't exist anymore. So I think it's important when we bring this discussion that often art is on a pedestal, and then you have the other discipline a bit lower, and it's important to consider everyone from the same family. So it's probably an answer to your question. I hope so.
Shall
Do you
we
think
vote?
because
Shall we vote?
because it's you're the guest, so you need to tell me if you think we answer that question. Okay. One more question.
Hi, everyone. I'm wondering if, for example, in saying there's a difference between designs and art, how can we make a one piece that combine design as and art in the same piece? So can we distinguish this piece as a design piece, for example, or an art piece? For example, a piece of furniture that has an artwork on it. Also, it's a piece of furniture that you can use it. So it has a design perspective on it. So in this case, what do you put in what category do you categorize it?
I won't answer that question. So who wants to answer that question?
Just don't put category.
Exactly.
Whatever you feel on it. It's we just vote on a piece that it should be done for Nassar Emirati design platform. Most of you vote as it's an art piece.
Yes.
So
You shall put it there to give it its value, its real value. For example, there is a piece that the designer can be the designer and the artist in the same time, in the same piece. So in this case, when there is an exhibition, for example, shall he put it with a design as a designer, or shall he put it in the for example, like Biennale? He brings it to Biennale, or he takes it to the STV, for example.
maybe because you are in the Biennale, maybe you can answer that.
It's not really because I'm in the Biennale, but I think one of the primary works that I find very interesting to be placed in the Biennale is Super Studio's work. Super Studio, and I think this kind of also reverts back to NFTs, because what are kind of these fictional ideas? Super Studio is a group of Italians, I think in the 60s, right? 60s, 70s, and they constructed these different worlds. The work that's in Warehouse B4, I don't remember the name, the first warehouse, is actually just a reconstruction of the world called the continuous surface, and it looks at this kind of nomadic lifestyle of the future. So I think it's quite interesting to have this, and it's primarily a research-based collage that was done in the 60s and 70s to question what are these utopian or dystopian futures that are possible, especially after World War II, where the world was in complete disarray. And I think that being placed within the context of an art exhibition kind of answers your question. It's almost like this platonic thought of what is the context and where do these things, like you place, and this is something I find interesting. You take that out, you put it in an architecture exhibition, it's purely an architectural collage. You take that, you place it here, it's an artwork. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, for example, I'm just saying an example. If you have a piece of furniture, you put it in the Saudi Design Festival, for example, and you consider it as a design. But at the same time, it has an artwork. So maybe if you put it there, it will not be appreciated as an art, more than it being...
But it's maybe also up to the curator to integrate objects in a art biennial, and for a curator from a design week to integrate art pieces into a design biennial. I think it's also a question of the organization to, as we were discussing, because it's just the next block, then the organizers build this bridge between each other and then basically have this opportunity to not consider clearly art, clearly design, but just basically have this in the same family. So that's definitely. We have.
Yeah, because sorry, maybe I'm being too impractical here. But I think maybe it's not a question of is there a problem with the work. Maybe it's a question of is there a problem with the platforms that we have, exactly. Right? Because you're absolutely right, and you started out your comments talking about how. Putting things in different contexts or changes their meaning, and I think that's absolutely true today. That immediately made me think of. I'm sorry with all these historical references, but I don't know why. But today, but in 1934, Philip Johnson at the Museum of Modern Art did a very famous show called Machine Art, and that's when he took these industrial objects like pots and pans and railroad springs and ball bearings, and put them in a gallery on pedestals and so on and so forth. And of course, he was influenced by Duchamp, who took the urinal and so on, the idea of the ready-made. But this shocked, the art world. But what he did was really in recontextualizing these common objects this way, that he created new meanings for them and different ways of them being seen. Right? It was very fetishistic, of course. But yeah, it really. The point is, it is all about context. So again, maybe it's not a question of the object being showed, but do we have the right context? Which is going back to the question of is the problem with the institutional infrastructures that we're still trying to rely on or still trying to create?
Sorry, just quickly to answer. I believe, from my little experience, art piece is too transparent. There is no mask. Design piece. We have to put the mask, huh?
Okay. I saw there were two questions at the back. We'll take the two questions at the same time and two quick answers, and then we'll have to wrap up. I'm sorry. Okay. So go ahead.
Thank you. It's very interesting. I just wanted to add to the conversation and go back to a point you made earlier. I think a couple of panelists made, which is also the question of what story you're trying to tell. So the piece fits within the narrative, which is what you mentioned, and it also fits within the bigger picture of what you're trying to do as a whole. So you no longer take the piece as a piece by itself, but you take it as part of a story, I would say. And I'm going to hand it over. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for a very interesting conversation. I wanted to ask on the point the lady was mentioning between art and design, is there a criteria, I'm going to simplify the question, is there a criteria of identification? So is there a criteria in which you identify an object as an artwork and a criteria in which you identify an object as a design work? And what would simply that be?
Aric, maybe because of your past experience with Design Miami? Tricky one.
Yeah.
I try.
Well, it's sort of like nationality, right? So I'm American, born and raised in the U.S. With museums, on the labels, you always have to list the artist's nationality. And of course, a lot of artists now, they're born in one place to families from other places, but then they live and work in another place, and so on and so forth. And I think the consensus is you just ask them which one they prefer, and it is what it is. The point being that I think there are no set criteria per se for identifying something as being craft or art or design. A lot of the times it goes back to the intention of the maker and also the context and systems in which that object are operating. So if you're a person who is making things that tend to be shown in design fairs, you're probably going to be thought of. Your work is probably going to be thought of as design first and foremost, no matter how conceptual or abstract it may be. And then this goes right back to the question of are platforms actually doing not the right, there's no right or wrong, but are platforms adequate for addressing these questions?
And coming from a curator, a question about criteria, I mean, I don't know what could be the answer, but again, I think in my case, the narrative, what exactly I want to tell and what the piece are trying to tell. So it depends on what the story, and it'll find its place. Obviously, knowing the context and the practice and the materials and everything will add, but the narrative for me is number one, where to decide this piece can go, because it will form part of the whole narrative.
On these good words, we say thank you to the panelists, to the audience. And if you want to carry on the conversation, I think you can grab those gentlemen off stage. Thank you again for the time you spent with us. And thanks to the organizers for welcoming us. Thank you and have a great evening.